I'm young. I don't need to save for retirement. Drew, I think this one, besides the budgeting one, makes my skin crawl, makes my blood boil the most because I just wish people would understand how important it is to start early and then invest often when it comes to saving for your retirement. Hello and welcome to the Neighborhood Money Podcast, a video podcast here to talk about all things personal finance and helping you build a life you deserve. If you're new here to the neighborhood, my name's Cavan, that's Drew, and today we're going to talk all about money myths. Actually, Drew and I, between each other, came up with 5 ones that we want to run through today, and I'm really excited because a couple of them are ones that I've been hearing for a long, long time, and today we are here to dispel them, to throw them away, and to tell you what the actual truth is around each one of these money myths. But Drew, before we dive into the main part of the episode, we've got some pretty exciting news here in the neighborhood. First thing first is that we officially have a website. So if you guys want to go out and check it out, it is neighborhoodmoney.card.co. That's neighborhoodmoney.card, CARRD.co. And that has links to our socials. It's got links to YouTube. It has links to the podcast, the different platforms that we're on. And Drew, I think one of the most exciting things that it links to is both some of the recommendations that we have out there is for books that'll take you right to Amazon, and also our new blog. Do you want to tell our listener, Drew, about the new blog that we've got going on?
Sure. I'm going to start with, I guess, the website first. So right now it's in like very early stages of a website. I think it looks pretty cool for it starting out. Is I think something a direction that we want to go a little bit is to eventually put out some type of budgeting material or like a worksheet or a small little ebook that you guys could be able to get for free on there or maybe a small cost. So I think that will be an addition coming sometime in the future. Also, going to the blog now, we're pretty excited about this blog. It's something that I think kind of puts us out of our comfort zone a little bit. We're going to try writing more, maybe 2-3 times a week, and putting just things that pique our interest that are kind of current right now, or some how to's or just tips. I think they're just small, consumable articles that you can read within less than 5 minutes that maybe don't take up a whole episode for us to talk about, but can just be some more content out there for you to kind of see what's piquing our interest and, uh, you know, kind of learn a little bit something along the way.
You know, Drew, I'm really excited about this blog because I try to read almost every single day. And specifically, I'm reading personal finance books more often than not. So to be able to put just some initial thoughts while I'm reading, to provide that to our listeners, super excited that we're going to have this blog as an option to do that. And hopefully you guys get a lot of value out of it. I know between Drew and myself, we're really excited about it because, like Drew was saying, we're going to talk about things that interest us. And I think it's going to be a good way to build out neighborhood money and the community and all the content that we're pushing out. So really excited about the website, really excited about the blog. If you guys check that out, let us know what you think about it. It's not going to be perfect. Like Drew said, we're in the beginning stages of it. Give us some feedback. That's going to help us out an awful lot. But with that, if you want to continue to support this podcast, there's a few ways that you can go ahead and do that. Definitely consider leaving us a 5-star review in Apple Podcasts. That thing goes a long way to tell other people that, hey, this podcast is worth listening to and it does provide you guys value. Additionally, with these new links through our website, we have different book recommendations. For example, like last week, we provided 2 recommendations. One was Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and the other was the little book of common sense investing. But if you want to check out any of our recommendations, it's going to bring you to Amazon through an affiliate link, which basically just means at no charge to you guys, if you buy through those links, it will give us a little bit of a kickback to help us uh, grow and to, at the end of the day, pay for some of the services that we use to put this podcast together. So it's going to really help us out a lot at no expense to you guys. And then lastly, over on YouTube. If you're not already, consider subscribing and like this video if it does provide you guys value, because that helps other people know that it's worth watching. So that's a long-winded way to say, hey, we appreciate you guys supporting the podcast. Let us know that you support us through those different mediums. So, but Drew, enough with that. Let's dive right into the 5 money myths that we've put together here for our listeners. So I think you want to start us off with the first one.
So this actually kind of goes along with one of the first blogs that we've just put out there, but it's kind of myth the myth of CPI is the gold standard for inflation. And in my humble opinion, I the more I read into CPI, the consumer price index, the more I feel like it's not necessarily the gold standard for inflation. When I'm looking at inflation, I'm looking at maybe how it hits me in a regional area, how it hits my cost of a living, how it hits me on my day-to-day consumables. I might be somebody that drives to work every day and it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes to work, or I might be somebody living at home or working at home. So these things, to me, inflation isn't an overarching general number. It's more personal, and it has to hit you in a certain way, and those rates can really range much higher than what the CPI comes out to be.
I think that's such a good one to bring, to put first, Drew, is because, you do see like inflation is 7%, you see inflation's 8%, but I can almost guarantee you that the individual is really seeing an inflation rate of 10, 15, maybe even 20%, depending on their spending habits, gas and groceries, being a huge part of people's budgets. But I think at the end of the day, you can't control inflation. All you can do is really control your spending. And if you can really bring in spending on things that maybe you don't need right now because those other things like groceries and gas are so expensive, maybe your rent's increasing. I think if as long as you can just focus on the things that are controllable, inflation at the end of the day, while it does hurt you and it does impact you, you can't control it. And I think it really means that you don't need to put too much thought about that inflation is at 98% across the country.
Yeah, for me, something too, just if I'm can my mind works a little bit better when I talk with numbers. So bear with me here. For the March 2022 CPI number, it showed inflation at 8.5%. But as you dig into this inflation rate, you can see something like energy had an inflation rate of 30, what was it? 35%, 32 to 35% increase. And within that energy sector, fuel oil led with the highest, which is more of an outlier of 70% inflation rate. So if you're somebody that's dependent on fuel oil for, say, your heat or other items, that really hits you. And that's not really shown in that CPI. I think another thing that the more I've read with this CPI being the gold standard is the methodology used for CPI has changed about 14 times, and that's per the Bureau of Labor Statistics that comes up with the methodology for the CPI. So that is something that gets my mind thinking too of if it can change and alter all these times, how much apples to apples are we comparing year over year? Or what areas are they actually picking and choosing that's going to affect this CPI number differently?
I really got two thoughts there, Drew. One is the fact that they do pick and choose a methodology to best fit, whoever is running, whether that's Fed or it's the government, to make it look better. And that's really unfortunate because regardless of the methodology that you choose to look at inflation through, inflation is hitting everyone. And like we said, it's hitting everyone different. But the methodology doesn't change the way that inflation hits people, which is, it's super unfortunate. And then the second, thought I had is we're in that high inflation environment right now, but you have to remember that inflation is looked at on a year to year basis, typically speaking. So we're gonna come to a time when inflation is going to be down to 4, 3, 2%, but that's because it's basing it off of the previous year that was high inflation, right? And so it's not like when inflation comes down, we're going back to what it was a year ago. We're kind of at that 8% baseline, and now we're going to measure on top of that. So when you hear that inflation is under control, it might be, but that also might be hidden in there that we're basing it off of an already heightened year prior. And so, you're still probably feeling the pain, whether it's at the gas pump, the grocery store, or somewhere else.
The year over year thing is very interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think if you do look at the inflation rate and it does seem lower, you have to think about if we're in an extremely high inflationary time, there's going to be a point where it seems lower and better, but it's more of a hidden year over year statistical arbitrage, or I don't even know what you want to use it for. But as you know, I think if we look at these inflation rates and if something you can do in your household is having a budget, and I think that brings us into our second section of what we've brought up as another myth is when you uh budgeting means you can't do fun things anymore. And what we've talked about on this podcast before is it actually does the complete opposite.
Yeah, and I 100% think that this myth just needs to finally be thrown out the window, because just because your budget doesn't mean that you can't do fun things. Actually, it allows you to do fun things, because more likely than not, when you're not budgeting, you're probably spending your money on things that don't actually provide you value. It might just be you buying something $20 here, $50 there, and at the end of the month, all of a sudden you have no excess money. Whereas when you budget, you can plan and say, hey, you know what? I really enjoy having a nice dinner once a month. I'm going to budget that into my plan because it brings me the most joy. And I think when we think about personal finance, Drew, it's all about finding joy with your money and building a life that you truly deserve. And budgeting is the foundation on which you can do that.
Budgeting does not mean you can't do fun things. It's really when you're like you were saying, when you can have a piece of paper that shows where your money's going, you can really see where the leaks in your budget have been, or the leaks in your bank account have been over the last couple months or even years. So when you get an idea and a structure of where your money is going, you now have the ability to actually do the things that you want to do. Being a budget, having a budget doesn't mean you have to cut everything you want to do out of it. It just gives you a pool of money that actually allows you to do that, and you can see that money, so you're not necessarily having to live as much paycheck to paycheck as you were before.
I think I got a really good example for this in what we do in our household. So this last month, April to be specific, each and every month we budget, and then we have some excess money that we either allocate towards more saving and investing or towards just a larger fun pool of money. And in April, we went to a friend's house, and Hannah and myself, and we played the Oculus Quest 2, which is virtual reality for those that don't know about it. And we were like, hey, this is super fun. Like, it was the first time Hannah's really enjoyed playing video games. It was just a fun group gathering. And the next morning, we were talking, we are like, should we just buy one to have that as like a social event at our house? And because we budget and because we have the extra money, and it's accumulated over time, like our fun excess bucket, we roll that over. But because we budget, we're like, hey, you know what? Sure, it might be expensive, but we can go out and do this because we have it in our plan, because we plan for these types of things, even though it kind of feels a little reckless in the time. But because we put together that budget, because we're more cognizant of our money, it allows us to do that and not just do it and then be like, oh crap, at the end of the month, we don't have money to pay the bills. And that's not the case.
What games have you played in that Oculus?
So
My
yeah,
nephew and
yeah,
niece have those, and I put them on, and I like almost got nauseous on one of them,
yeah.
the roller
Yeah.
coasters.
So we bought Beat Saber, which is kind of like a
Oh
Star Wars
yeah,
game where it's a rhythm game. Um
you can definitely get in the rhythm with that one. When the speakers are next to your ears and you don't know anything else around you, I was like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
dancing during it.
Yeah. So we had that, and then I also bought ping pong because the friend's house that we went to, they have ping pong, and now we can play ping pong virtually together, which we've done once. And I got to tell you, Drew, man, we played for like 30 minutes.
and you're
And I was
sweaty.
like dripping sweat at the end of that.
It doesn't take much for you to sweat either. So, let's
Exactly.
keep that in the frame. All right.
But besides the video game Oculus, budgeting is such a good way just to operate your financial life, because it's going to provide you so much more room to you know spend your money on things that truly find or bring you value. But Drew, I think let's go to number three. So money myth number three is there is no good debt. And actually, this might not be the case depending on how you view debt.
Debt can be an instrument to be good. And I think when you hear the term or the myth that there's no such thing as good debt, is it tends to be over the mindset of buying that boat or buying that four-wheeler or buying that trailer or buying whatever these highly depreciable assets that don't bring any value monetarily to your household. And that, I think, is where that big myth comes from. When you can look at debt in a way of assets and using it to build wealth and use it as an advantage tax wise, I think there is a great argument that there is such thing as good debt.
And I don't even think it has to be from like a buying an asset, for example, going into debt to buying a rental property. I think if you can manage low interest debt, for example, buying cars, right? We talk a lot about how you shouldn't buy a new car because you have that depreciation, but right now maybe the environment doesn't quite follow that. But if you can keep, you need a car, and if you don't have the money, for example, to pay $30,000 in cash, taking out a loan that's manageable is okay. There's rules of thumbs about how much debt you should have for your household. But I think the thing to remember is, even outside of pulling out debt for assets to invest in, even having some debt for things like a car, as long as you keep it manageable, as long as you keep investing in other areas for your future, for retirement, I don't see all debt being bad. And that's coming from a guy that absolutely hates debt. I've got to put that on the record. I don't like it at all. We only have a mortgage. And that's because houses are just so expensive; it's almost impossible to pay in cash, right? But I think there is a place for a lot of people to have a healthy amount of debt.
This brings up that money 101 philosophy, and that's a dollar today is worth more than a dollar in the future. And that brings up, in my mind, if you have your healthy consumable debt, it's hard to save up a large, say, $50,000 for a vehicle. And if you did have that much saved up, you might have that huge chunk that just goes strictly into a vehicle. And there can be options or opportunities for you to only take out a manageable loan with lower interest and then take all that extra money and either help build up an emergency fund or help and put it towards more investing for your future.
Absolutely, yeah, and I actually like that. If you are going to take out debt for a car, for example, make sure that you're still putting away money for the future. Make sure you're still buying those appreciating assets like an S&P 500 index fund, for example. If you guys have listened to this podcast before, I'm a huge fan of that. But make sure that because you're taking out debt, you're not limiting those investments, because having your money in the market or whatever asset you choose, having it in there over time is going to be so much more beneficial than putting more money down the line. And so, as long as you can balance those two things and avoid high interest credit card debt, we don't want any of that in the neighborhood, none at all. But if you can manage, mortgage, car debt, things like that to a reasonable amount of your annual income, there's really, no harm, no foul there. And so, Drew, I
Or,
think that then brings us to what is it? What are we at here? Number four on our list. And
yep,
Drew, this is one that I think we heard a lot growing up, and we probably still hear a lot from time to time. And that's when you have the option for more money, for example, when you have the option for overtime pay, you need to make sure that you're not getting bumped up in tax bracket, because then it's not worth it. And actually, Drew, it's super unfortunate because that couldn't be further from the truth. A little background around how taxes work. I know it's not everyone's favorite subject when it comes to money, but in the United States here, we're actually on a progressive tax system. And what that means is, as you make more money, you'll pay a higher percentage of your income. But the thing that people don't realize is that if you bump up from, say, a 22% tax bracket up to a 24% tax bracket, your entire income isn't taxed at that higher tax bracket. It's actually only the amount of money in excess of the 22% threshold, meaning that even if you do bump up in tax bracket, you're not automatically then paying the entire of your income on that higher tax. You're only going to pay a higher tax on the amount of money that exceeds the tax bracket level that you've crossed.
This is one I hear a lot up, well, I think growing up, but especially even now. And there's so many people that have worked so much overtime or they wanted to work more overtime to make more money. And then by the time their paycheck comes, I end up hearing them say, this doesn't make any sense. I worked an extra 8 hours overtime and I made like $100 more or whatever it might be. And so this one's always intrigued me. I'm glad you put this one on our list because it really is interesting to see where is going to be that fine line of working more hours and working more hours for less money. There's kind of like that balance in there. And it's such a strange thing to think about because it almost decentivizes you from working. And I think that's one of the craziest things is you have an employee that wants to work more, but then all of a sudden they get paid less for doing that extra work. So then they just almost have no motivation to continue to do this overtime.
But I think at the end of the day, it's not like you're working for no money, right? Because whenever you make money, you're always going to pocket more. But yeah, it is a bummer that if you get bumped up, maybe those overtime hours might be taxed at a slightly higher tax bracket. But it's the thing, I think the myth that we're trying to dispel is that if you bump up in tax bracket, your entire income is not taxed on that. Actually, what ends up happening is you get calculated an effective tax rate, which is always going to be lower than the income bracket that you're in. So, for example, I'm looking at some income tax brackets right now. The 32% tax rate is for income levels for single filers between 170,000 and 216,000. So if I was to make somewhere in that range, my tax effective tax rate would actually not be 32% because you'd have to take into effect credits and deductions, and then as well as the progressive tax system. So I'd probably be somewhere around the 20 to 25%. And so that's just kind of how the US tax system works. It's progressive. You end up only paying the taxes that your effective tax rate is. We won't go into that a whole lot of detail because that gets quite complicated pretty quickly. And, it's probably not a whole lot of fun to hear people talk about numbers over a podcast. So maybe we'll just leave that to maybe a blog post that we put together in the future.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this myth back around and got me off my little bit of a tangent there because I think that's exactly right. I'm glad you brought us back and made the point that it is not your entire income that gets taxed at that higher tax bracket with the progressive income tax. It is actually just that certain amount that hits over. So that dollar amount that hits over your threshold, that's what gets taxed at that higher tax rate. So thanks for bringing me back from my little bit of a tangent there, Cav.
Hey, I know we all get frustrated when it comes to taxes. No one actually wants to give your hard-earned money away in taxes, but when you live in a society on, you do have to have that responsibility. But hey, so I get the, little tangent action there because I could go on it too. But hey, let's move to number 5, and that the myth is I'm young, I don't need to save for retirement. Drew, I think this one, besides the budgeting one, makes my skin crawl, makes my blood boil the most because I just wish people would understand how important it is to start early and then invest often when it comes to saving for your retirement.
In this myth with I'm young and I don't need to save for retirement, I would have to say from experience, there's a part of laziness or scared or you don't want to actually do it because you're taking more money out of your pocket for doing what you consider to have be fun things at that time in your life. So this one is definitely one of those myths where when you're young, it's definitely the time to start investing for retirement because you get no second chances at compounding interest. And I think you actually put in a few calculations on our workbook here that really show the power of starting early compared to waiting into your later years.
So let's take A fairly simple example of someone that starts investing when they turn 20, and then someone that starts investing when they turn 30. So let's look at the first one. Someone that starts investing at age 20 and only invests for 10 years. So just invests in their 20s from 20 to 30. So 10 years worth of investing. If they invested $350 per month over that 10-year period and assuming an 8% return, which is roughly in line with what the market provides, by the time they hit 30, they would have $64,000 with investing 42,000. Now, if they completely stopped investing from age 30 to 65, by the time they turn 65, so roughly retirement age, they would have $1 million in this account. And let's just assume it's a Roth. So you would have no taxes going forward. So you'd have $1 million off of only investing for 10 years. Okay. So now let's go to the 30-year-old. So started 10 years later. If they started at 30 and invested all the way until retirement at 65, so 35 years of investing, and they invested the same $350 per month at an expected or an average 8% annual return. When they got to 65, they would have $800,000 in their account, which is $200,000 less than the 20-year-old that only invests for 10 years.
And this 3065 is an extra 25 years of putting money away, and you have $200,000 left at the same age of 65.
You
Those
invested,
numbers, those
yeah.
numbers make your brain almost explode because it
So
doesn't make you almost feel like it doesn't make sense that you can have 10 years of investing only.
10 years of investing versus 25 years of investing. The 10 years of investing, because they started earlier, is going to be worth $200,000 more at retirement in this example. And here's the kicker, Drew. The 20-year-old, like I said, invested $42,000 over that 10-year period. The 30-year-old invested $190,000 over the course of their investing period to still have $200,000 less at retirement. So I just think that example really shows how important it is to start early and then to invest often. And I don't want that example to be, oh man, I'm not in my 20s, am I lost? Am I hopeless? No, no, no. Start today. Start your investing if you haven't, because it's better than starting 10 years from now. And you don't need $1 million in retirement. Whatever that number is for you, you can figure that out. But the whole point of dispelling this myth is you need to start now. And if you're in your 20s, don't wait until you're in your 30s, in your 40s, or even some people that start in their 50s and 60s.
If there's any myth on this list that has some concrete numbers and factual backing behind it, all their other myths did too. Okay. But this one can picture so much. I feel like I should get like a stamp that says debunked. And I just want to like, boom, debunked.
That reminds me of like Mythbusters. It's like busted.
Yeah. And so that myth, if you're young, you should definitely start. But like we said, it should not discourage you if you're a little bit older and you want to start putting money away. More money or more, some money is better than no money putting away.
Absolutely. So, Drew, that was our 5 money myths that we dispelled. But wait, we've got one bonus myth that we wanted to bring today. And that bonus myth is buying a house is always better than renting. And, Drew, I think this one is so important because people get so caught up in, I need to buy a house because when I rent, I'm just throwing away my money.
This was one, as we started this podcast, I never really made a big effort or doing a deep dive into this topic. And the more I dove into this topic, the more I realize it's not buying a house is better or renting is better. I think it's more of a it depends. And this is one of those myths that it can be, debunked that it's actually not better to it's not always better to buy a house. But if you look at just some of the items in your situation, let's just say, for example, that you are only planning to stay in an area for 1 to 3 years. Would you really want to put all that money down into a house and then having all the issues with the actual house and not having as predictable monthly payments? And that's to me is like that area right there would be I wouldn't want to buy a house. I would rather rent. And then you can even use some calculation to see what could I afford for a house and what would be comparable for rent. And you can probably see that there's a lot less money that gets put into your rent than you would be if you had to buy a mortgage and sell within like 2 years.
I mean, buying a house just frankly is very expensive between realtor fees, between taxes, between, having to do the maintenance on the house, the yard work, and all of the stuff that goes into owning property taxes. It adds up really quickly, and people don't look at it from that way. They look at the rent versus the mortgage, right? They don't account for property tax. They don't account for those fixes. But you're right. We do have a really neat tool or hack or whatever you want to call it, and that's called the 5% rule. And you can use this rule to get understanding of if it makes more sense to rent or if it makes more sense to buy. And again, this is not accounting for things like, hey, I want to move every 2 years, or I'm going to have a couple more kids or start a family and we need to have a larger house. None of that's taken into account here. This is purely just from a money standpoint. But the 5% rule breaks down or goes a little bit something like this. So if you compare a house to a rental, so buying the house or renting a similar size house, you can use a 5% rule. And what it tells you is, are those two things comparable and which one should you consider over the other? For example, if you're looking at a $500,000 home to buy versus a $500,000 home to rent, what you would do is you would take the 500,000, so the value of the house, you would times it by 5% and then divide by 12. And that number, specifically in this example, is a little over 2 grand. That number, then you can say, okay, well, if I can find a rental that is that amount of money or cheaper, it might make more sense to actually rent the house rather than buying it.
And if I always think about this too, and I think some people I listen to on podcasts and other YouTubes is when some of these people have been or just like serial entrepreneurs or they're just getting off their feet and they actually prefer the renting side of it. And that's the fact of they're very flexible to move from city to city. They're very flexible to go from potential job to a job, and it's predictable. They know how much money is going to be put into this every single month, and on top of it, they're so focused on their businesses that they're trying to build that they don't want to worry about putting in a new water heater or changing a light bulb or fixing the fridge. And so just the headaches of actually a house could be one of the big positives that I tend to hear from these entrepreneurs and other YouTube and podcasts that they really like about renting compared to buying a home.
One way I really like to think about this, Drew, and full disclosure, like we have bought a house, right? So we're not advocating one way or the other. But one way I like to look at it is people always talk about how your house can be used for your retirement, where actually our family doesn't even account for our house in our retirement years. So I think if you can kind of put aside the fact that you're looking at your primary resident as an investment, if you can kind of throw that to the side and still focus on those other long-term goals for retirement, and you're going to get there. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if you're renting or buying. It really just comes down to your individual situation.
And I'm glad you brought up the 5% rule. I think to wrap up this section, I just want to bring up the 5% rule again. And if you're looking at potentially buying a home or renting a home, it's just a great calculation to benchmark how much is going to be comparable between if you actually did want to buy a home or rent the home. And just to finish it all up here, just I think that really goes to show from what we talked about that buying a home may be good for some people but may not be good for others. So buying a home is not always better than renting.
All right, man. So that's five money myths plus our bonus money myth that we completely debunked. You can put the debunk stamp on there. Uh, but so, what would you say some of your main takeaways are? Let me go first. I think out of all of the six that we went through, the one that jumps out the most to me is the fact that you need to start investing sooner rather than later. I think our example really laid out the power of investing early and then often. and the fact that compound interest is your friend. And the longer you can have your money invested, the more it can be compounded, and the less you ultimately will have to invest to reach your long term goals. For example, in our the 20-year-old versus the 30-year-old, they invested only $43,000 to become a millionaire. And the 30-year-old had to invest 4 or 5 times as much as a 20-year-old and still didn't get to that millionaire status just because they waited 10 years. And so, wherever you are, it's so important to start investing, whether you're in your 20s, 30s, or even in your 40s and 50s. You need to start today because the power of compounding is going to be your friend over time.
If I brought up anything for my key takeaways during this episode, it's really that these 5 myths are just 5 that Cavan and I, think about. There's so many myths that you may be hearing day in, day out about, personal finances, anywhere in that realm. And it really brings up the point to me that you may be hearing these things over and over again, but it's up to you to do your due diligence and to look at the question and the answer and then really see how it affects you and how it's unique to you. There's so many times that we've talked about in this podcast that personal finance can be so personal to you. There's not a cut and dry formula for everybody. You have to look deep down at your own household and see how it's going to actually affect you. So, going through these actual myths or whichever ones you hear, just make sure to read into them, see why people are saying it, see how it affects you, and you might be surprised to find out that these myths are actually just myths.
We've got some pretty exciting stuff going on in the neighborhood with the new website, with the blog, with our ability now to provide recommendation to our listeners if they're interested to read some of the books that really inspired us to get on our financial journey. So that's a lot that's going on in Neighborhood Money's neighborhood, but what's going on over in your neighborhood?
I don't know if this is like a good financial thing or a bad financial thing, but I feel like it's good because I actually was able to save some money. So at our house, well, we've been wanting to get a water softener, and I've been pushing off on it because I just feel like our water's fine. We don't really need it. It might scale up in some areas, but we'll just clean it off. Uh, but I had a buddy reach out to me and say, "Hey, have you heard about this auction website?" I went onto the auction website, not thinking anything of it, and I saw a water softener, and I was like, you know what? I just think I'm gonna go for it. I'm just gonna go. If I bid on it and get it, cool. I'll get a good price. If not, no sweat off my back. I'll just keep looking, and I can still
Yeah.
procrastinate of getting a water softener at our house. And I actually went on the website, started bidding on it, tried looking on the internet what this water softener retails for. Ended up being a nice water softener, brand new in the box. I end up saving what I thought at the time was roughly $250. It turned out to be only $200, and that's because of some, uh, 10% fees and taxes, stuff like that. So I have to say, I was pretty excited at getting a water softener for cheaper than retail. So that was good. But the biggest point of this auction thing is I have to be careful and I got to push myself not to go on it because it's like addicting to go onto auction sites.
Especially because it's competitive. Like, you are competing against someone to buy something. And I know,
Yeah.
at least for me personally, I would get my competitive edge on, but like, no, you were not beating me. And all of a sudden we're like $200-300 over the retail. And it's like, ha, I won, but I also just spent
Well,
$400 more.
that's exactly it. You're watching the clock, and I went like $50 bid more than I wanted to just because somebody bid. I'm like, don't bid. I'm gonna like come through this uh, computer and get at you. And I was like, I turned to my wife and I said, I wish I was some type of like a really good hacker where I could bid on this and then find the IP address of the person bidding against me and just shut down the internet. that's where my mind went. But it was like it. I felt very competitive, and I was getting heart was racing. I was probably starting to breathe heavy towards the end of it when it was like 5 minutes left, 4 minutes left, 1 minute left, 30 seconds. And I'm like, do not bid on this. Otherwise, I'm going to be bidding more. So, yeah, it was very fun. It's competitive. It was exciting. I just have to be careful because I think you feel like you can find a lot of good deals, but it's on stuff that you probably wouldn't have bought.
That kind of reminds me of like eBay or something like that, right? Where you can actually bid.
Yep, same
I've
deal.
actually never have done it,
I
but
got
that's pretty cool that you can go out and get like a water softener because,
mhm.
when you were telling me about this a little bit earlier, no one likes to buy those type of things. Like, for example, we just got quote on gutters. Like that is like the lamest thing to spend your money
Yeah.
on, but pretty necessary.
Exactly. So I'll go down. That was pretty cool. It is very similar to eBay. I've actually done eBay auction before on uh, uh, a golf driver, and so you can like golf driver. You can. It's kind of nice. If you get them like a year or two old, there's like really no technology changes, but you can get them for much cheaper. And then if you get them on the auction side of it, eBay is like a great place to buy golf clubs. So I started out with a really cheap thing of golf clubs and I'm slowly trying to build it, but only if it makes sense on if I get good prices on them. Because I'm not a good enough golfer to have nice things.
I wish I was a good golfer, but I am by no means going to put the time in to become a good golfer.
I've tried to put some time into it and I still suck. I don't know what it is about golf. I feel like I can pick up other sports fairly good. I feel like always like to be very technical and I watch, YouTube and see how to do this and how to hold this and how to swing this. And then I get out to the course thinking I'm going to be bombing this ball. And next thing you know, it rolls 2 inches in front of my feet and I want to break my golf club over my kneecap.
Can't say I've ever broken a golf club, but I've had the feeling of just wanting to snap that thing like after someone like that's playing baseball struck out, just snap it across their knee. Man, I've had that feeling multiple times. And that's why I no longer golf. But Drew, let's wrap this podcast up. I know I don't have a lot going on over in my neighborhood. It's just springtime finally here in the metro. So I actually might get out and mow the lawn today or tomorrow. So we'll see how that goes, but not a whole lot's going on over here. Besides the fact of we finally got some warmer weather, get to mow my lawn, try to recover from the vole attack
Yep.
that we saw
Get some
this last
fertilizer
winter,
out there.
but we'll see. I want to get some grass seed down. Pretty excited. Hannah calls me a nerd all the time about how excited and giddy I get about the springtime and getting my grass going. But hey, gotta love it.
We need to have like
Gotta be the best in the
we
neighborhood.
need to have like a subgroup of neighborhood money, just like the neighborhood money dads, and it just like mowing
Yep,
grass and barbecuing and drinking some domestic lights.
I like it. Yeah, getting some of those Miller diets and
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Neighborhood Money Podcast. We went over 5 personal finance myths with a bonus one. We thought that they were very engaging. We really like talking about them. What other myths do you think we missed? What other myths do you hear? Let us know in the comments on YouTube or on any of these other podcast platforms. We truly, truly appreciate it. If you made it this far, we want to thank you for listening to this uh, Neighborhood Money Podcast episode, and we will see you guys next week in the neighborhood.